Last Sam's Cage by David A. Poulsen, Chapter 17, Part 1, page 174. June 20, 2:45 p.m. There are horses at the zoo, not the kind you see in pastures, in every direction from Calgary. These horses are smaller. There are only 2 of them, and they look more like early ancestors of the horse than like any horse I've ever seen. The sign on the fence outside their pen says they're Przewalski horses, a wild breed that once lived in Mongolia but are extinct there now. The remaining ones live in zoos and on animal reserves. Przewalski horses aren't pretty, but I don't care. They're horses, and that's good enough for me. I've loved horses since I was a little kid. I even had my own. This tall Palomino named Sonny. We kept him at a farm just on the edge of Long Prairie. I spent a lot of time with him. I even did my homework sitting on his back in the paddock out behind the barn. Not that you get a lot of homework in grades 2 and 3, but Sonny and me, we read a lot of picture books together too. I liked these horses as soon as I saw them. They're in an outdoor pen, and now that the weather is finally better, I'm over at that part of the zoo a lot. There's this big boulder not far from where they are, and I like sitting up there. That's where I am right now, writing stuff in my notebook and reading that mystery I ripped off in the B&E once in a while for a treat. I bring along something from the snack bar. That's easier to do now that I've got a little cash. Now that the B&E is over, I've been feeling ... I guess you'd say relieved and safer. I move around the zoo more now, and I even sit here on this boulder in the middle of the day. I still get out of sight if I see zookeepers coming, but I don't hide when visitors are walking around. I figure it doesn't matter if someone who knows my mom or Steve sees me. Even if they mentioned that they'd seen me here, they'd probably think I'd been here for the day, like everybody else. Nobody is going to suspect I actually live in the place. I've been trying to make friends with some of the animals. That part isn't going all that great, except for the gorilla, who seemed like she was reaching out to me, and the little duck that I see every morning. The animals pretty much ignore me. The Przewalski horses are no different. Yesterday was a good day. I was sitting on the boulder, and the weather was perfect. It seems like it's been windy every day since I've been here. But yesterday was totally still, and there was even a little bonus activity in the horse pen. The veterinarian and one of the zookeepers were trimming the horses' feet. Even with the weather as nice as it was, the zoo wasn't very busy, and almost no one came along to watch the hoof trimming ritual. I was kind of happy about that. It made it feel like this was my private place and these were my horses. They had to tranquilize the horses. Tranked, I heard the veterinarian say. So they'd stand quietly while the work is being done. The zookeeper held one of the horses while the veterinarian worked. Even though they were tranked, the horses got impatient once in a while, and the zookeeper almost got run over a couple of times. The veterinarian worked quickly and carefully. The idea seemed to be to do a reasonable job without getting kicked while doing it, which made sense to me. First he gave the horses another needle, probably just something to keep them healthy. We had to give needles to Sonny sometimes. Then the vet started on the feet. First he snipped off the part of the hoof that had grown long. Then he filed the hoof smooth and round. I watched until one horse was finished and the other had 1 foot left to do. Eddie stopped writing and looked at his watch. It was just after 4 o'clock. Time to go. Eddie had something to do. He'd made up his mind about it a few days earlier, and today was the day. Eddie wanted to go home. Not actually go in the house, of course. Just close enough to watch, and more important, to see his mother. It was Friday, and that was the one day Steve let her out of the house on her own. On Friday nights, Eddie's mother went to bingo. Before Steve, Eddie couldn't remember his mom ever playing bingo, and he still couldn't imagine her enjoying the smoke-filled car lot-size rooms of people gathered in to play a game he had tired of in about grade 5. Maybe it was just the chance to get out of the house and away from Steve for a while that made bingo appealing to his mother. That he could understand. Or maybe it was Steve's idea that she go to bingo after all. If she won anything, it would bring money to a household that could use all the extra cash it could get. Whatever the reason, Friday night was bingo night, and on this particular bingo night, Eddie would be behind the lilac bushes near the bus stop across the street from his house. He would be able to see his mother without her seeing him. It wasn't that he missed her. He would never forgive her for bringing Steve into their lives and letting him do the things he had done. No, he didn't miss her. Besides, he'd only been gone for 2 months. But she was his mother, and he had to know that she was all right, that she was at least safe. The bus was crowded. Eddie walked downtown and caught the number 6 bus that went by his house. His mother would take the same bus to get to the bingo hall. Eddie looked around at the other riders. He was a little nervous. He still didn't want to see anyone he knew. It wouldn't have been a disaster, he told himself. He'd simply get off at the next stop and work out a different way of getting to the house. The house, not his house or our house. He didn't think of it that way anymore. The people who lived there weren't strangers, but they didn't seem to link to him in any real way either. They didn't feel like family. As he sat looking out the window, Eddie thought about his mother. He hadn't thought about her much, hadn't let himself think about her, since he had left home, but now, with the diesel drone of the bus and the muffled conversation of the passengers as background, Eddie Slater let the thoughts creep in. What had happened? The woman who lived in the house on 44th Ave was so different from the person who had been his mom when he was growing up in Long Prairie. It was hard to believe she was the same person. How could that have happened? Did she love Steve so much that she was willing to stop being who she was? And had she been willing to abandon her child along the way? Or had she just lost interest in her son and life? That was what it seemed like to Eddie. Yet how was that possible? How could the woman who had been so interesting and interested when he was small have changed into the dull, lifeless person he knew now? He couldn't remember the last real conversation he had with his mother. He and his mother had had. Had they ever done that? Or was that something he'd just dreamed? Made up somehow out of hazy, distant memories? No, he hadn't dreamed it. She was the smiling woman with the pickle-smelling hands on canning day. She was the person who sat on the edge of the bed when he was sick as a little boy. That was funny, too. His dad was there when he was scared, and his mom was there when he was sick. Every time he woke up, she was there, always with her soft voice and a touch that made even the mumps tolerable. She had been so special to him then, and now she was gone. Was it fear that changed her? Eddie could have understood that at least. No, that was wrong. He wouldn't have understood it, but at least he could have tolerated it, forgiven it. But could someone be so afraid of someone else that she would stand by while her child was being beaten senseless by a man who gave neither her nor the child one moment of happiness? How could that be? He didn't know the answers. He wasn't even sure he was asking the right questions. But for the first time in a very long time, Eddie felt sorry for his mother, and he felt sad for what he had lost. What had happened, what had been taken from him. Eddie's eyes were wet. He turned farther toward the window to make sure no one could see. At least none of the tears were working their way down his cheek. If that happened, he'd have to wipe them off, and someone might notice. He opened his eyes as wide as they would go, partly to keep the tears in, and partly to help them dry before they overflowed onto and then down his face. Outside, the weather was changing. So much for the great day. Dark clouds were billowing up and out of the north and moving fast toward the city. If they didn't veer off soon, there would definitely be a storm, maybe a bad one. Not a great night to be out, Eddie thought, but it didn't matter. This was something he wanted to do, and he didn't want to wait another week. He was mad at himself for almost crying, just like the time he'd taken Patty Frederick to a movie and almost cried at the end. Geez, how embarrassing had that been. And now there he was, in a standing room only bus, close to blubbering. He wanted more than ever to see his mother. It crossed his mind that she might not. She might not go to bingo tonight. Steve might have stopped letting her out of the house at all. The sadness Eddie had been feeling gave way to anger. But it surprised him that it wasn't his mother he was angry at. There were only a few people left on the bus by the time Eddie rang the bell. The stop he had chosen was 4 blocks from his house. He was the only person to get off. The wind was whipping up and the temperature was dropping fast. Eddie looked at the sky. There was no way this storm was going to miss Calgary. And as usual, he hadn't dressed for the weather. He told himself it wasn't really his fault. There was no way he could have known about the storm. It had been beautiful all morning and into the afternoon. He glanced at his watch. She should be leaving the house in about 15 minutes. He pulled up his collar around his neck, shoved his hands in his pockets, and started walking. The rain started when he was still a block from the bus stop his mother would use. By the time he was in position behind the bushes, it was coming down hard and sideways. Thanks to the driving wind, the lilac bushes didn't offer much protection. Maybe she won't be going to bingo tonight, even if she had planned to. I wouldn't be out in this if I had a choice. Eddie looked over at Mr. and Mrs. Hunt's house, no lights on. He hoped Mr. Hunt was doing okay. Eddie decided he wouldn't wait long. He'd give his mother one bus. If she didn't get on that one, he wasn't hanging around. He was already soaked and shivering, but she did come out of the house. She waited until the last minute. In fact, Eddie almost ran into her. The bus was almost at the stop, and there was no sign of his mom. So Eddie had stepped out from behind the bushes to wait. That's when he noticed her running toward the stop from the house. If she hadn't had her head down and an umbrella in front of her as she crossed the street, she'd have seen him. As it was, Eddie barely had time to get back behind the lilac bushes. The umbrella was covering her face and head, and she got on the bus so quickly that Eddie got only a brief look. No way he could tell if she was all right. No way he could tell anything about. All he could see was that she was wet, although not nearly as wet as him. As the bus pulled away, Eddie leaned out of the bushes, hoping to get a glimpse of her as she took her seat. But she sat on the far side of the bus. It pulled away and out of sight without his seeing her again. So far the evening had been a write-off. Here he was standing across the street from his former home, about to catch pneumonia, and he hadn't really done what he'd set out to do in the first place. Oh, he'd seen her all right, but he had no idea how she was doing. Of course, maybe he wouldn't have been able to tell that even if he had gotten a better look. Still, he would have liked that chance, and to top it all off, he would now have to stand in the rain until the next bus came by. He could die first. With my luck, the next bus will be a convertible. He didn't die. In fact, his luck improved. The next bus came along about 5 minutes later. Eddie had never been so glad to be inside something in his life. The bus driver grinned at him. "Rotten night out there?" he said as Eddie dropped his fare into the box. "Yeah." Eddie nodded and tried to wipe some of the water from his face. The effort was wasted. His sleeve was at least as wet as his face. The driver reached down, pulled a towel from a sports bag on the floor near his feet, and handed it to Eddie. "I'm going to the gym later, but I think you need this more right now than I will then." Eddie took the towel, but hesitated. "Are you sure? How are you going to dry off after your shower?" The driver waved a hand at Eddie as he eased the bus out into traffic. "I'll get one there. They got lots. Go ahead." Eddie didn't argue further. He dried his face and hair, then handed the towel back to the driver. Thanks a lot. 4 seats back is a good place to sit. There's heat there. Should warm you up." "Okay, thanks," Eddie said again. "If they ever have one of those bus drivers of the year awards, I'll put your name in it." The driver laughed. "They don't have one, but if they did, the prize would probably be a bus trip somewhere. Don't bother." Eddie started down the aisle of the bus, then stopped and turned back to the driver. "There's a big bingo place around here somewhere. You know where it is?" "Sure, it's up a ways. I go pretty close to it. You want? I can let you know when we get to that stop." "Yeah, please, that'd be great." Eddie counted back 4 seats and sat down. The driver was right. Heat was pumping out of a big vent down by his feet. It wasn't long before Eddie was feeling warm and even a little drier. He had a decision to make. He wasn't sure why he had asked the driver about the bingo place. He couldn't go in and risk being seen by his mother, and he sure as hell wasn't planning to stand around outside while she left. So what difference did it make whether he knew where it was or not? But now that he'd asked, he'd look pretty stupid if he didn't get off at the stop. "I hope there's a coffee shop somewhere close by," he whispered to the rain that was pounding against the bus's window. Eddie was still thinking about what to do when the driver cranked his head around and looked at him. "Next stop for DJ's bingo place. They tell me the DJ is pretty much a crook, so don't plan to win much." "How can you cheat at bingo?" Eddie stood up and walked to the front of the bus. If there's a way, DJ will find it." The driver braked the bus to a stop and opened the front door. "It's just around this corner and a half block up. If you run like hell, you might not get too wet." "Right," Eddie said as he stepped off the bus and onto the sidewalk. There was no sign of a coffee shop anywhere. The rain had eased a little, but Eddie knew he'd soon be soaked again. If he didn't take the driver's advice, he ran, and as he did, he formulated a plan. He'd go into the bingo hall. The place was huge. He knew that much. If he could spot his mother before she saw him, he'd be able to find a safe place to watch her. As he got closer to DJ's, with its gaudy neon sign telling the world there was a $2,500 blackout bonus winner every Friday night, Eddie could see holes in his plan. Quite a few holes.